While millions of men are celebrated for peaking early, for knowing exactly who they are by 22 and never looking back, there's a quieter group who spent decades feeling like they were running in the wrong direction, wearing the wrong personality, answering to a name that never quite fits. And, according to psychology, they weren't falling behind. They were building something most people never get the chance to build. A self that actually holds up. Stay with me. Because what I'm about to tell you will completely change how you see every year you thought you wasted, every path you abandoned, every version of yourself you tried and discarded. And if you've ever felt like the man you were supposed to be was hiding somewhere in the wreckage of who you tried to become, this is for you. Here's the thing nobody talks about. Becoming yourself later in life doesn't mean you failed at being young. It doesn't mean you lacked direction or wasted your potential. And it definitely doesn't mean the men who figured it out early are somehow ahead of you. But there is something fascinating happening in the psychology of men who bloom slowly. Something completely different from the narrative that says your best years are behind you if you haven't arrived by 30. Psychology shows that men who become themselves later often have what researchers call a longer identity formation arc. While some personalities crystallize early through clear feedback, stable environments, and uninterrupted paths, others require more data, more experiences, more failures to subtract. Think of a man who tried the corporate track at 25, the artistic path at 28, the solitary life at 32, and finally found his footing at 38. Most people call that lost. Psychology calls it iterative self-construction. Research indicates that each version you tried wasn't a mistake, it was a hypothesis tested against reality. And the man who emerges from that process isn't more broken than the man who never had to question. He's more examined. Number 1, you needed more time because you were given the wrong script early. A lot of men grow up handed a blueprint for who they're supposed to be. Provider, protector, performer, stoic. The script arrives before they have language to question it, and they spend years building a life that impresses everyone except the person living it. Psychology shows that men who break through later often do so only after the script fails catastrophically enough to be questioned. The divorce. The burnout. The moment at 40 when you realize you've been applauded for decades for a performance you never auditioned for. Research indicates that this collapse, as painful as it is, creates something called post-traumatic growth. The breaking isn't the end. It's the first honest conversation you've had with yourself. Number 2, your empathy was built backward. Most people assume empathy is a soft skill you either have or don't. But for many men, empathy arrives only after they've caused enough pain to understand its weight. The man who was emotionally unavailable at 25 often becomes deeply present at 45, not because he read the right book, but because he finally felt the cost of his absence in someone he loved. Psychology shows that men frequently develop emotional fluency later in life because the early years were spent suppressing it for survival. Research indicates that this delayed empathy, once integrated, is often more stable and more genuine than the performative kind. You didn't miss the window, you were still building the capacity to hold it. Number 3, you were collecting evidence the whole time even when it looked like wandering. The man who becomes himself later often has a resume that makes no sense to outsiders. Teacher turned carpenter turned therapist. Soldier turned poet. Each shift looks like instability, but psychology shows something different. Research indicates that men with varied life paths score higher on measures of psychological flexibility and adaptive resilience. You weren't lost. You were cross-training. The skills you built in that sales job you hated, the patience you learned in that marriage that ended, the solitude you endured in that city where you knew no one, they all become available to the self you finally claim. Nothing was wasted. It was just deposited in an account you couldn't access yet. Number 4, you had to unlearn before you could become. This is the one that hurts the most. Some men peak early because they never had to dismantle anything. The path was clear, the values were simple, the world rewarded them consistently. But for men who become themselves later, the process often requires deconstruction. Unlearning the shame that taught you wanting was weakness. Unlearning the competition that taught you every other man was a threat. unlearning the silence that taught you your interior life was irrelevant. Psychology shows that this unlearning is cognitively expensive. It takes time. It takes failure. It takes the willingness to sit in the empty space between who you were and who you're becoming without rushing to fill it with another performance. Research indicates that men who complete this process report higher life satisfaction at 50 than men who never questioned at all. The delay wasn't a deficit. It was the price of authenticity. Number 5. You were waiting for permission you didn't know you needed. A lot of men don't become themselves because the world never reflected their actual self back to them. If you're quiet in a loud family, you're broken. If you're creative in a practical environment, you're unrealistic. If you are tender in a hardened culture, you're soft. Psychology shows that men often require a specific mirror, a person or a community, or even a single conversation to finally recognize what was there all along. Research indicates that this delayed recognition is common in men who don't fit dominant masculine templates. You weren't absent. You were invisible to the wrong eyes. And the moment someone saw you accurately, the self you'd been protecting finally had a reason to step forward. So what does all this mean? If you're becoming yourself later than you planned, later than your father, later than your friends, later than the culture told you was acceptable, you're not behind. You're not a late bloomer. That phrase implies a flower that simply opened slowly. You weren't slow. You were underground, building roots in soil that didn't want you to grow in conditions that required more architecture than the ones planted in easy ground. The man you are becoming isn't less valuable because he took longer to arrive. He's more durable because he had to build himself without a blueprint. And if this reached you at the right moment, hit subscribe, turn on notifications. Linear Torch 26 exists for men who are still becoming. Every week, I break down the psychology of identity, the quiet strength of delayed clarity, and the men most people never learn to see. The world won't stop rushing you, but you can stop apologizing for needing the time you actually needed. Subscribe now, not because you need another voice in your head, but because you need one that finally sounds like your own.